Hey, everybody. This is Optimizing Developer Productivity. And today we have what seems to be a pretty interesting panel of execs and practitioners in the industry. And first, you might want to ask yourself, well, what is developer productivity? And one way that we like to define it is how do you get code out to production or staging or other places quickly and at high quality, so safely. And so we have some folks here from Facebook, from Slack, from Stripe, from Brightline. We've covered startups, we've been at large companies, et cetera. And so the goal of this panel really is to discuss what key issues there are that allow companies to improve their developer velocity, to improve their quality, and also to measure it. So how do you know if you are actually improving? And then also, this isn't all about computers, it's also about the people. And so how do you measure your own performance and understand how that tracks your own career and allows you to become a better developer yourself? So by the end of this panel, everybody in the audience should have at least one or two new things that they can try with their own teams to improve either their velocity or their quality, or at least to measure it and kind of know what's going on. So hopefully that's what you'll get by the end of this panel. And so right now, what I'd like to do is walk around the Zoom and say hi to everybody and let them introduce themselves. And I will start with, roll the dice, let's see, Scott, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Scott MacVicar, and I run the Developer Productivity Group at Stripe. And I've been there just over 2 years.
And what's maybe one top of mind thing that you're thinking about these days in terms of developer productivity?
I think one of the things I'm always thinking about is like, how do we sort of make things fast? Like, how do we increase the sort of interaction time? Like, our engineers want things to be, almost magical. They want their feedback to be instant. They want to get that signal quickly, and it's trying to sort of strive for that magic, I guess, is something that's keeping me up.
Awesome. Let's move over to Rukmini. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rukmini Reddy. I'm the VP of Engineering at Slack. I run developer platform here. And the top of mind for me, I think, is how are our engineers and developers doing in this remote world? And what does productivity look like? Like, how can we keep our speed up when we don't sit together in the office anymore? I think that's been top of mind for me, as I'm sure it is for most of you these days.
Very cool. And Ryan, what's up in your world?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Ryan Bergauer. I'm Director of Developer Productivity at Facebook. And actually the thing that Rukmini said really resonates with me. I think right now we're seeing what it's like for everybody to be remote. In the world that's coming, we know that some people are going to be remote. And a big thing that's on my mind is how do we not create two groups of engineers, those who are sitting next to each other and have fast office networks and those who are maybe working from home. And so trying to find ways to not only even the bar, but even lean into this idea that like, hey, we could do things differently, maybe get something even better out of the situation, and trying to find ways to pull that off.
Yep, we will definitely be touching on this in the questions. And Julian, let's hear a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Julian. I work for a recently founded startup called Brightline, and I'm mostly thinking about laying the correct foundation for future scale and the right balance between process and freedom to keep velocity high.
Yep. Yeah, and you'll hear a lot today about scale as well. So these are interplaying things. There's people, there's scale, there's measurement, and then there's, well, what are we actually trying to optimize, and then why? So as sort of a prelude to the questions, I'd like to sort of say like developer productivity, it spans the entire life cycle and maybe even beyond that of software development. And you can start with a specification, right? Like how quickly can you get to a specification that allows people to start coding? And once you have that, then how long does it take an engineer to get into their development environment? Do they need to provision a database? Do they need to get machine learning? Do they need to configure a machine? How fast can they actually start coding once they're ready? And then once they've started coding, then how quick is that build, test, review cycle? Like, can you iterate through that quickly? And do you know when you've got a high signal, like high value, high quality thing coming out of that code review and test cycle? Next is the deployment. How do you know that you have a high quality deployable artifact that you can actually get out to a particular audience? Production, staging, maybe a few other people to test. And then last but not least, once it's out in the world, whether that's production, staging, et cetera, how do you measure whether it's doing what it's supposed to? There's user experience there. There's performance. There might be regression. There might be improvement. How do you know? And so all of that contributes to the developer experience, but also the product experience. And so when you think about developer productivity, you think about kind of those 5-ish areas, and that's all geared towards how quickly and safely can I get code to a particular audience. And so given that, we have some questions then that we'll sort of walk around the room on, and they cover these different stages, but also touch upon the people, the scale, and other things like that. So Rukmini, I'm going to start off with you. And this is sort of thinking about like key steps in the development cycle. And you've grown and managed large teams at some crazy hyper-growth startups, and now just recently joined Slack. And what I'd like to ask you, and maybe follow up by Ryan, like what are some of the key areas of development that managers should track and manage? And what are some that the developers themselves should track and manage?
That is a great question, Peter. I think as a manager who's been through like different stages of scale and different kinds of companies, I think some of the most important metrics for you to track are like your process and Scrum metrics, like you mentioned, like the beginning of the specification to when the specification eventually lands in build and goes through test and then deploy in build and finally ships. That's really critical. The quality metrics, like how is your quality? Like what are the incoming bugs versus outgoing bugs? How much regression have you caused? Performance and reliability metrics on your product are really important. And especially in case of a hyper-growth startup, sometimes your survival might depend upon how quickly you ship software to your customers or how quickly you can get to a product market fit. So in that case, I would say the most important metric for you to track is cycle time. This is literally the time it takes for your team to ship software to a customer.
Great.
This is on the manager side.
Yep.
Now to get into the developer side, if you are a developer, I always encourage my team to think of yourself as the CEO of your own career. Right? Like you should track metrics on how you are performing as an individual contributor in the team. For example, what is your throughput like? What is it to collaborate with you? So what kind of review speed can your colleagues expect from you? How are you spending your time? Are you innovating? Are you maintaining? Do you want to learn a new language? What does that investment look like for yourself from a career progression? So, and how you can make meaningful progress there. I feel like these are all different areas I'm sure, most of you are going to touch on, but these are things that I value a lot as an IC and as a manager.
Great. And then Ryan, maybe touch on that, but also like I was thinking like threading through workflows, possibly like the different types of workflows that are in a company.
Totally. So yeah, I love the list that you just gave. I think all those are massively important. It's kind of hard to add to that. I will say that one of the really important things is, as we all know, you change what you measure. And so one of the huge things is use your intuition and figure out like, A, what does the company need right now? And then B, what do we think we aren't doing really well? And then go measure that and try and change it. And so one of the things that we look at Facebook is not just how individual stages of that development cycle look for the company, but also how they look for different populations of engineers. Because the way that you ship a website is obviously very different from how you ship a mobile client, which is very different from how you ship a server, which is totally different from doing machine learning or hardware development. And so we've broken down a lot of the ways that we talk about developer productivity by the ecosystem that you're working in. And one of the big things we've had to do with that, since they're all so different from each other, is identify just like 5 things that intuitively you believe are really important to that ecosystem, and then start by measuring those. And what we found is over time, new things that you really care about more will pop up. But if you at least have a good baseline for the things that you think are hurting you, you can start moving against that while you fill in other gaps there.
Great. It's really interesting to touch upon like the act of measuring causes behavioral changes. And I think that's true when you measure yourself, as well as when you measure teams, companies, and then different constituents within those companies. So moving over to sort of like speed of code, and Scott, this one's aimed at you. What are like, and thinking like the barriers to shipping code, and at Stripe you have to ship code both quickly and safely as you manage both your customer data and your own. And like, what are some of the key things that allow you to do this? And maybe also like, what are some of the things that are keeping you up at night that aren't allowing you to do this or might break in the near future?
So Stripe is, we see ourselves as like infrastructure for other, our customers' business. Like if we are not there, they can't take payments. So our goals are really like zero downtime. And that means like the code that our engineers write has to be both reliable and performant. So we sort of take a multi-tiered approach in the development loop to try and like catch errors. So I guess 2 years ago, we open sourced Sorbet, which is our type checker for Ruby. And the idea there being that if we can sort of check the code base and sort of catch it as the engineers are sort of typing writing the code, we can, surface those errors rather than catching them in production. And then we sort of extended there by then taking that and implementing it in VS Code. So, you get the sort of squiggly lines is you're either, using the wrong data type. I think the best example there is merchant. For us, is that an ID? Is that an object? Is that a name? The types are kind of important there. So if we can sort of try and catch it there, it's better. Then, of course, there's tests. We have hundreds of thousands of tests. And, we run that almost on every change that our engineers put up, and they want sort of timely feedback. But again, if we take too long there, that's sort of wasted time for them. And then the final stage is like automated deploys. We try and take the manual processes that our engineers are doing. We can make them more reliable when a machine does it, but we can also make it more reliable when like a separate system itself does it. So it's sort of the tiered approach of all of those that sort of allows us to get to safe, reliable code in sort of a timely fashion.
Yeah, super interesting. Is there anything that's keeping you up at night that like you're like, oh man, this is gonna break someday, maybe someday soon, and we really need to fix this?
A lot of things keep me up at night. I think the one that jumps to mind is just we keep encouraging engineers to write tests. We'd rather have them write tests, and that will take longer to run. So like, how do we balance between having our entire code base as the working set versus like some smaller, more compartmentalized set that we can run tests on? So yeah, it's the scale of the like tests that sort of keep me up at night. We can throw more machines at the problem, but that comes with the trade-off of expense.
Yep. And then I'm wondering, and Ryan, do you have anything to add sort of like on that testing scaling side?
Oh gosh, on testing. I will say, like, that's a huge topic. One of the big things that I care about on testing is the opposite of great testing is not having tests that you can trust. Like, it's better, in my opinion, to have no tests whatsoever than to have tests that don't give you valuable signal. Because at the point that you have a gigantic code base where you have code being contributed by people who you don't know, with tests that you don't know what they're doing, and you get to a place where one of those tests fails and you don't trust the system because the system has flakiness in it, you've instantly lost all value from your other tests. And so I would posit that we've spent more time trying to give signal around the quality of your tests and the reliability of your tests and the value of your tests more than investing in the test frameworks themselves. And it's paid off pretty well for us.
Yeah. And I mean, this really brings us to sort of developer experience, right? And Julian, I'd be really interested in knowing, like, does this, you're a practitioner, right? Like, you're starting to build this and thinking about scaling. Are these the types of things that you're thinking about now? Or what's kind of slowing you down from a developer experience? Do you have the VS Code plugins you need? Do you have the tests you need? Are the systems failing you, or are they giving you good signal?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a lucky spot right now with the code base being fairly small and the test suite running really fast. So that's not a concern right now, but from past experiences, I totally second what Ryan said. Automated tests in general, automation is key. And I don't want to check out a code base and then start reading the README and, take 15, 20 or 30 minutes until the application is up and running. Ideally, I just want to sit down, type a single command, and I can start iterating on the application.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting when you start looking at the evolution of companies through their testing cycles, or maybe testing levels is better. So, at first it's really fast, everything returns really well. And then you say, well, we need more tests because we want to have both more coverage and get more signal. And you start writing lots of tests and you try to run them all. And then at some point you realize you can't run them all. And Rukmini, I'm wondering, like, where do you think either your group or Slack is in kind of this area? And I can give my opinion too, but I'd be really interested. Like, you just joined, like, how are you seeing kind of like where we sit in this testing spectrum? Because once you get even bigger, then you have to start really, do you write AI to think about which tests give the most signal at the earliest point in time, et cetera?
Yeah, so I haven't been here very long. I've just completed my 8 weeks. So I would love for you to correct me if my impression is incorrect. But I feel like we are at an inflection point, right? We are that startup that's now a big company, and we're a public company, and we have a lot of customers, and our tests, we are starting to feel some of these tensions at this moment where it's like, yes, we have a great test framework. We have a lot of reliability in our tests, and it's really important. And how quick are these tests? Are they hindering us from moving quicker while shipping software? So I feel like that's where we are. And Peter, I would love to hear your perspective, but that's my take on things.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, we are, I was also at Facebook a few years ago, and it's very interesting because we're starting to see enough tests running. And Scott, you're probably in a similar area where we're starting to really think which tests are giving the highest signal, which ones should we not be running or maybe running later in the process because, yeah, they give some signal, but these ones here will give us signal earlier so we can get back to the developer and say, hey, something's broken, and they can trust that signal. But yeah, I would agree where, and as you get to kind of like where, when you have a few hundred engineers going on to 1,000 engineers, you're starting to run into enough load on the testing system that, yeah, as Scott mentioned, you can start throwing machines at it, but it becomes both expensive in time or in money or both. And so to follow up a little bit on that, like how, and maybe Ryan, start with you and Scott afterwards, like how do you ensure that you are getting high signal in testing? Like you talked that that's important. It's almost more important to have high signal tests than to have any tests at all. So how do you think about ensuring high signal in these tests?
Yeah, this ties back to the first thing I was saying earlier around developer productivity, that you need to measure the things that you care about changing. We had to learn to measure it, right? We had a period of time we were like, hey, how are our tests doing? And that turned into, hey, do we even trust the signal that we're getting back? And how can we start thinking about that? And so I won't go into all the details on some of how we're doing that, but it really is keeping as much data as possible on your tests, and then going back and mining that data for patterns and understanding for a given test where you see it failing and then working again and then failing and then working again, how to capture that and how to surface that as quickly as possible. And then I think the other piece that's been huge for us is similar to what Scott was saying around the type checker, getting as much of that signal as early as possible. We talk about that as shifting left, where it takes an order of magnitude more time to fix an issue that gets to production or is caught in CI than it does when you're looking at it in your IDE while you're writing your code. And you can catch it through type checkers. You can catch it through asynchronous jobs. There's a bunch of different clever ways to deal with that right now. And we're leaning more and more into that as a way to make sure that we don't have to worry about the signal once it gets to the CI system, because we don't want to think about it there.
Yeah, the problems when you get there are really big. Scott, anything that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think there's always the balance between convincing engineers they need to write tests, because they're always thinking about that trade-off. And it's usually hard to show that there's value writing tests on the 1 week horizon, but it's the value of those tests measured in a month from now or a year from now when someone else comes and sort of looks at the code. And I think that's always been the sort of balance there. And then really encouraging engineers to write the right sort of tests. I don't want people to test the actual implementation. I'd love for them to test the sort of interfaces that they're calling into, because those tend to find more issues than testing that they implemented, MD5 correctly. Mm-hmm. And it's more how it interacts with other areas of code. So those are the things that are sort of top of mind for around tests.
And Julian, I'd be interested in sort of your opinion here. How do you know as a developer, when do you start feeling comfortable that your tests are giving you good signal, or are you even writing tests?
Big fan of testing. Wouldn't feel comfortable without them. It's hard to find that balance, specifically in the beginning, and when it comes to the speed of the test suite, where focused unit tests are so much faster, but they test things in isolation instead of really providing a lot of worth. I think, yes, in the beginning, and the further down you go, the more important it is to test the contracts between different pieces of the application and making sure these contracts are well defined and strong, and having more overarching integration tests that test the interactions between the different systems.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I find also that we're doing a lot of load testing as well. And so you look for regressions or other things. And that's sort of one of the things at Slack we're starting to do. So if I move, and Rukmini, I'll aim this one at you. Like, I'm starting to think about metrics and people. So, you know, we talked a lot about measuring systems. And in particular, we dove kind of deep on testing, which I think is super interesting. And by the way, if there's one thing you could do, measure how much signal you're getting from testing. Like that's like, you know, one thing you could do to improve your throughput. So, but if you start thinking about scaling teams, like what are some of the key development metrics that you track and measure? And I say development sort of purposely a little bit vaguely, like that could be people, it could be, you know, systems, whatever. Like what should developers know about themselves as well to track and manage?
Yeah. Again, great question. I think one of the key metrics as I think about scaling engineering organizations is PR throughput, like your pull request throughput by the number of contributors you have. Like, especially if you are in a team where you're onboarding people constantly, I think it's really important for you to have signal on how this scaling is affecting the rest of your team. So as you add, it's not always necessary that you add more people and you're going to go faster. We always wish that was the case, but you know, I think keeping an eye on that is really important from a more team holistic, like engineering leadership. That's what I care about. But as a person who is an underrepresented minority and who was once an individual contributor on a team, I wish we had the tools to measure back in my day, you know, in my early career. Like I often struggle with like imposter syndrome and felt like I had to contribute like 10x the code to have a seat at the table. And now we have all these tools where you are able to measure how an individual is contributing to a team. And I feel like it is the responsibility of that individual contributor to track so that they can actively manage their career progression. And I feel like it's not just for the ICs, but as a manager, having these tools are so useful because they help you overcome the bias. And I feel like you can support all the members of your team equally because now you're having very data-centric conversations. For example, if you have somebody who's like spending all their time in maintenance, but they really care about doing more innovation, your conversation can center around, why is it you are spending so much time maintaining the existing code? And you might get an answer saying, hey, I'm the only one who knows this piece of code. That's why I feel like I have to maintain it all the time. And that opens up all these avenues, like how can you better cross-train your team? How can you distribute the glamour work to everybody? And this is something I care about deeply.
Yeah, and Ryan, I'd be interested, like, what does this look like in a remote world?
Oh, goodness. So actually I can give you a great story about that. When we were really looking into the impact that remote work was having on our engineers at Facebook, we saw that we were actually pretty productive. And we felt great about that because we were looking at one particular metric. And as we started to dig more and more into what was happening, and what we found was that people were working longer and longer hours because they could take advantage of the fact that they were always around their work computer, right? You no longer were landing something in the middle of the day to make sure that it got in before you went home. It was, I'm going to go make dinner, so I might as well try now. And it's 7 p.m. And then at 10 p.m., I'm going to check on this other thing because I'm walking past my computer again. And what we found was our engineering team was finding ways to adapt to working from home to stay as productive instead of the actual things that we cared about that were demonstrating productivity being true. And so that has completely changed how we're thinking about the types of optimizations that we're putting into our tools, the ways that we're trying to make things better for folks, and ultimately redesigning our workflows at the company to better support people who are working remotely. Cool.
And so, and this is like a fast but pointed question. So, Rukmini, how fast should people respond to code reviews?
I feel like in a great high-performing team, the review speed should be less than 24 hours, especially in a remote world. Mm-hmm. It's aspirational.
Yeah. Julian, what do you think?
I think I can second that with the caveat that in a world where there's a lot of pair programming and a pair might feel comfortable shipping code without a code review, maybe it should happen immediately.
Mm-hmm. No, really good point. And Scott and Ryan, start with Scott. Any thoughts on that?
Same day. Our SLA is SLA for code reviews is like 8 hours, assuming it's within the sort of one business day. Maybe that's the best way to frame it.
Great. And Ryan?
I think it depends on your code review tool. Sorry. One of the things that I've seen is a great code review tool should suggest to you, like, this is a thing that warrants extra attention. And this is a thing where when you get to it, you get to it. And because of that, if you have a prioritization, it might take you 2 days to get to something that is a small little review and your teammate knows that that's true, and then you move on. And it may take you, if it takes you longer than 8 hours to get to something that is absolutely critical, and it is the thing where you are the expert and you're not looking at it, that's a huge problem. And so I also put some of the burden on that, on the tool itself, to show you what you care about.
Yep. Super cool. No, thanks for answering all of that. I think like these, there's some nuances here, but when you think about, as sort of a developer of code, and you think about like, what's your priority? As soon as you take a break from typing, what's the next thing I'm going to do? Often that could be do the code review or check and see if there's somebody waiting on you to do a code review, because you are blocking your colleague from shipping, or at least giving them advice on why they shouldn't ship it. And so that's sort of a nice little algorithm that I like to use, which is, hey, here's a reminder, right? As soon as you look up, take your break. But as soon as you come back from your break, your number one priority is to at least service the code reviews that are waiting, or say that you can't do it. And then as Ryan mentioned, if you have a tool that actually hints at the priority or where this should go, that's even more helpful as you scale. And so I'd like to think a little bit more about kind of like looking forward. Scott, like you've seen scale at Facebook and at Stripe and a bunch of places and what are sort of some of the bigger problems that you see facing, now that we've talked about kind of there's developer experience, there's measurement and monitoring, there's testing, like, are there any spaces that you're sort of worried that we're not approaching yet? And then Ryan, maybe I'll go to you, and actually I'll probably go around the room on this one.
Yeah, for me, I think this is the architecture adapts. As the sort of company has grown, we've sort of had to look back and sort of think about how are we architecting, our code base. Something that worked 10 years ago might not work now. So for us, it's services, but we're trying to understand how we could sort of expand our usage. It sort of brings in its own challenges because we need to work out how to add it onto the existing code base, but also how to like operationalize it, make sure it's efficient and reliable. And then from the developer perspective, it's like, how do you develop and test against services? Do you use QA versions, do you use local development versions? And, that's one of our focuses, I guess, over the next year is like adapting the code base as we've sort of grown as a company.
Yep. Yeah. And Ryan, you've seen some major scaling also at Facebook. Like, what are some things that you're worried about? Like things that you might not be able to deal with now, or if it were, 10x as big?
Oh, man. I think one of the things that we're seeing is, especially among the family of Facebook apps, there's a lot of sharing of code. And that not only is limited to cross app, but also cross platform, right? There are things that we've written for iOS that we want to use on Android as well. And at a certain size, one of the interesting challenges that we have is most of our engineers don't think of themselves as iOS engineers or Android engineers. They think of themselves as working on dating. And they may be implementing that feature in multiple places. And one of the things we've had to reckon with is this idea that the tool chains are completely different. And yet there are parts that we control of the tool chain, your code review process, which I mentioned earlier, how you submit code, all those different things where we need to get them as close as possible so you can pick up from one type of work and immediately move to the other type of work and not lose any momentum going on it. And the thing that's cool about that is as we've started the shift, and we're still really early in it, the tools that we've built that are shared get that much better because we're not maintaining 36 different things. We're maintaining one thing and having it work really, really well across the spectrum.
Cool. Rukmini, anything that you wanted to add there?
I think for me, it's always like as you scale, like to make sure that work is consistently getting through the software development process, like to make sure there's no bottlenecks. And given like we are living in an existential crisis and people just don't have the bandwidth that they used to in the past, I think how can we build better teams together that like collaborate and are able to move work quickly, where everyone's engaged and feeling productive is something that it's top of mind for me. Great.
So thanks a lot for attending this session, and thanks everybody in the audience for coming. I'm hoping that you learned at least one or two things that you might go implement. It could be, respond to code reviews quickly. It could be, understand that once you start measuring something, then you can affect its behavior. It might be that, you just should write more tests, or that you shouldn't write any bad tests. How do you know you're writing bad tests, right? That type of mentality, I think, is really good. And think about, as from a developer perspective, how are you moving and shifting left, getting more information to the developers, like in VS Code, for example, or in their IDE, and really early on so they can fix problems at that point. And so, as homework for everybody in the audience and also for ourselves, I'd highly recommend try one of these things. Like try measuring something, see where it takes you, right? Try asking a question. If you can't measure it, just ask somebody else. Hey, you say there aren't enough tests. How many tests are there, right? How fast are you reviewing code? How many people are actually stuck on deploying? And measure that. Understand what cycle time means. How fast can you get through sort of build, test, review, get code out to production? And so, and if you encourage engineers to know more about their own productivity, how does that affect your own team morale and performance? I bet that it will affect it in a positive way, especially as we move more remote. So again, thanks to our panelists. Thanks, Rukmini. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Scott. It's been super great to have you and see you all around the Zoom. And with that, I'd like to wrap up and say thanks to the audience for attending this Optimizing Developer Productivity panel. Thank you and sayonara.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.